Hey there. We have a new track out, and it's time for another track breakdown. So, the track I'm talking about is Dutcheast and myself's new single out on Deep Root Records. It's called Up and Down. This is a tune we wrote at the beginning of the year, actually, at the beginning of 2020. And the story's pretty unique. Andre, who's Dutcheast, my friend, came over, and we had been talking about working on kind of a darker kind of house record. I had just picked up some new gear, and we talked about using it in the track. And that day, as we were beginning to work on the record, I got a text message from my wife, who at the time was still my fiance, saying that Kobe Bryant had just died. So that immediately put a damper on the entire session, and it was really hard to continue to work without having that in the back of our heads. So that's kind of the backbone of where this song began. It began in a very interesting circumstances at the beginning of what was to become a very interesting year. So I wanted to just kind of jump in and go through some of the choices, the creative choices we made. I'm going to just play a little snippet of the tune from the break here, and so you can kind of get a sense of where this is at.
Okay, we're going to keep doing this till we get tired.
So you kind of get a sense. It's like a really driving kind of blends between house and tech house kind of tune. It's rather fast. I don't typically write music at 126 BPM, but this song did. I believe this is written in F minor. The significance being there, it's F minor is pretty powerful in the bass. We wanted to write kind of a clubbier tune, so we decided that F minor would be a good spot for that because it's got a lot of power. It's got a lot of a low F note carries a lot of weight. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind when you're writing, is that the key can kind of dictate how the result of your track. So try and keep that in mind. Another kind of interesting part about this, and like I don't want to go into every piece of detail, but like I said, I had gotten some new gear, and I'll show you that in a second. But what we had decided to do were these hats were written, and a lot of the initial drum ideas were written from my TR-09, that little unit over there, which is Roland's boutique version of the TR-09, the legendary drum machine. And so this is kind of the pattern we had programmed. And there's a couple different iterations of it, but it's all very quick, very driving. And the idea was to just kind of create a lot of movement in the track by changing up that hi-hat pattern. So, you don't always have to, I guess, it doesn't have to be such obvious changes. Like that is felt, those little rhythmic changes, especially in those hi-hats, especially when they're that present. That's like the most present drum track in the entire track. The other part about this that I think is worth mentioning is that when we first wrote this, this kick sample and this bass line was completely different. And this is something I do a lot, where I will write an entire tune with one maybe specific kick drum or one specific bass line, and then when it comes down to mixing the record, I just kind of hear the record a little differently and think, this isn't cutting it. And so that's when I typically will make the decision to either completely change the kick, change the sound, change the bass line, change that sound. And typically at that point, I can really hear the record for what it's going to sound like. And I think sometimes when you're creating and writing and just throwing all these things in, you're hearing a different version of your song. So you're naturally going to kind of make different creative decisions then too. So the kick we ended up going with this was this Hit Kit kick, which if you're not familiar with Hit Kit, really great sample library that came out in probably the early 2000s. I still use it to this day. It just has great sounds, a lot of drum machine sampled drum sounds, and a lot of great other percussion, and really anything you'd need is in this pack as far as drum sounds go. So just kept it pretty simple, a little bit of crazy EQ going on here. This was just this is a technique that my buddy Nick Garcia did a little demo on, and I was really trying to emulate what he was doing, and that is to kind of tune your kick through EQ. So if you see, this is at an F. This is taking out what's called the tritone, which is the most dissonant it's the most dissonant tone from F. So that's a B. And so I just kind of did this on what would be the lower fundamental and the second fundamental of this kick drum. And then you can see it is now hitting F. So that's, being a very, there's not so much melody going on in this track. So I thought it was important to really create some harmonic and melodic information in my drum samples. So this kick, while I didn't want to pitch it around, you can see that it's not being transposed. I wanted to kind of bring out some of those overtones in the kick, which would be those F overtones, and taking out the tritone, the B overtones. So on top of there is kind of another, this is called the Black Box from Plugin Alliance. This is one of my favorite. It's a harmonic saturator. It's emulating the Thermonic Culture Vulture, which is another really great piece of gear. And this is essentially also, this is also a piece of gear, but it was kind of emulating that Culture Vulture, which I think that is an older analog piece of gear. The Black Box is a little bit of a newer design. And this is just kind of warming up a couple things, adding a little bit of air that they are, this is made in conjunction with Brainworks and Plugin Alliance. They really love these air functions that just kind of really brightens up the top end in a really clean way. And then on top of there, SSL, E-console, channel strip, just boosting a little bit. It looks in the 600 area, taking out a little bit of mud in the 200, boosting a little in that sub area. And that was about it. So now the bass, and that's really, the whole song is really the kick, the bass, the drums, and that vocal sample. And then there's kind of just all these different moving parts to kind of keep it fresh and keep the arrangement going. But this bass line is from my that's from my Behringer Pro 1, which I've done a little video in the past on. The Behringer Pro 1 is an emulation of the Sequential Circuits Pro 1, which came out in the early 80s, late 70s. And like I said, when we decided that the bass line needed to change, I went and wrote it on that piece of gear. And that's another thing I'll show you. Now, one thing I do here that I don't really do that much anymore, but this is certainly a technique you could do if there's certain plugins you don't have that can essentially multi-band sidechain. So what I do here is just duplicate the channel, and then I use in Ableton, their multi-band dynamics has a very clean crossover point, and now that's typically used for compression expansion. It's the OTT is part of that. In this instance, I'm just using it as like a crossover so that I'm not getting any phasing issues by splitting this, filtering out one frequency part from one channel and keeping the rest in the other. And this is all an attempt so that I can kind of sidechain each of those frequencies differently. So here's the low bass, and this is sidechaining pretty hard here. I think I'm also, and this is just kind of controlling it a little bit. But this is all being filtered by the multiband dynamics. And then this mid bass, I use the black box a little bit to warm it up a little more and make it a little more present on some maybe laptop speakers. This is some interesting EQ. Just trying to, even by filtering it, I still felt like I could remove a little bit more. And I think, again, adding in that a little more of that F overtone to really push the fact that this is an F. Now, that's an analog synth. It's not always perfectly in time. So I think my thought, and like I said, I wrote this at the beginning of the year, so my memory's hazy on why some of these mixing decisions were made, but I would imagine that I was trying to just emphasize that F even more, because it's really just playing F, and the rhythmic of it is what gives it the bounce. And again, now I'm soloing the other section, so everything 120 and above. And that kind of sounds like this. Now, I don't really do it this way anymore, and the reason being, you can hear some clicking going on, and that's just some zero click kind of errors going on. Basically, the compressor is ducking it at a point and causing those clicks. I use Pro C2 now, and I have a little preset that I use, and I use this, and I don't get any more clicking. So you live and you learn, but that's a cool little trick. I guess I'll just show you what I'm doing on my drum bus. Another thing that I do a lot is I'll use this NLS summing from Waves, just to get a little more analog feel. This is emulating a Neve desk. Sometimes I'll drive this. Doesn't look like I did that here. But these are great for just adding a little more analog flair. Typically, you can put this in stereo. If you leave it in dual mono, which is cool, is essentially it separates the left and right channel and puts them on almost two different channel strips like you would an actual board, mixing board. And it just creates subtle differences in both the left and right. So it creates a little more stereo. One thing I found when I first started doing this, especially on like your lows, I would have to sometimes I would put a stereo version on here. And if you're in dual mono, even if you have everything monoed, your kick, your bass, it's all monoed out. As soon as you put that dual mono NLS channel on there, it's going to immediately start separating it again. So just something to keep in mind if you do end up picking up this tip. Plugin Alliance, a lot of the Brainwork stuff has this really cool technology, TMT, threshold modeling technology. I think that's what it's called. and that is doing the same thing. They build that into a lot of their other plugins so that you don't have to just get a summing plugin to do that. You can, you can just throw on a compressor or one of their channel strips and it'll do it for you. Okay, so on top of the drum bus, I also had the API 2500. This is my go-to. I would say 80% of the time, this is my go-to drum compressor. And I really like the Waves one. I'm sure the UAD one sounds even better. On top of there, I have got the SSL E-channel console channel strip again. Really just doing a little bit more EQ work, bringing out some of the, taking away some of that harshness in the top end. And that looks like that's all I'm doing there. A little bit of filtering too. And then I like to use this, and I don't do this as much anymore, but I like to kind of even out my drums. So, and this is just grabbing peaks. So you can see it's just kind of grabbing some peaks here. I don't do this all the time anymore, just because if you overdo this, you can really get some tonal changes. So it's almost better to use a clipper or a just like a one-band limiter than a multi-band limiter here. So I don't, like I said, don't always do that anymore. But that's most of the track that I really wanted to go through. There's obviously this part that I think is really cool, where the stab kind of slowly increases. And that's a pretty common trick. You can emulate that on a CDJ by kind of decreasing the, you're essentially truncating the loop. So you could set a loop, and then I think if you hit the out button, it brings up the capability for you to shorten that loop length with the jog wheel. And that's kind of what's going on here. And the way I like to do those is getting simpler. There's a handful of ways you could do these. But so let's get I'm going to find a stab real quick. Something better than. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll put one long note in here and put this at 0. So there we go. Okay. Now, if you put this into loop mode, turn off snap, and you can start getting this to happen by shortening the loop. So pretty easy, right? It's really cool. It's done in tons of house tracks. One thing you probably started hearing was that those little notes at the end here when it's getting really short. And that's, again, kind of similar to what's going on with the side chaining. It's just creating these little noises that aren't part of the sound naturally. It's kind of being created because the sound is restarting at points where there's no zero crossings. So if you zoom in here, you can see there's 0 crossings happening here, and the sound is starting over at points where that's not happening. So to get rid of that, you want to just move the start in a little bit here, and then you want to add some fade, and that should get rid of it. then it's gone. So hopefully you guys use that little trick. It's a really fun one. I'm going to dive into the gear that we used over here, and that'll be how we wrap up. So let's jump in. All right, so here we are at my synth rack. I've got a few different pieces of gear here. This is the Pro 1. This is what the bass line was written on. I'm not going to go over this, though, because I've gone over this piece of gear in another episode that I did that is up on my YouTube channel. This is what I'd like to talk about. This is the TR-09 from Roland. This is their boutique emulation of their classic TR-909 drum machine. This is almost completely identical. It's a lot smaller, a little more compact. It runs on batteries. It's also got some updated features that make it a lot easier to use in a recording sense than the older version, the original version that I think was released in the early 80s. So the TR-909, you know, if you're a producer, you know all this, but this is kind of what house music was based around. This is how Chicago house was birthed. These sounds are still used all over, especially the open hat. That sound is used in house music in almost every record you hear. It's not really house or tech house without that 909 open hat sample. It's even used in some disco records. You know, it's just a very versatile drum machine, and the sounds are just so iconic. So I wanted to show you a little bit how it works. So up here, this part of the face is the drum sounds. So you've got a kick drum, snare, you have your toms, you have a clap, or I'm sorry, you have a rim, you have a clap, and then your hi-hat section and your cymbals section, which is your crash and your ride. Now, this is your tempo. You've got some pattern, and these are for kind of programming a song. So you've got your pattern recall, you've got your bank recall, you've got a couple different other settings and writing modes over here, and then you've got your sequencer down here, a few other, you know, your start stop, your this knob kind of controls a bunch of different things. And the main part of this is the sequencer. So let's start I'll show you how to program that. It's pretty simple. You're going to hit your instrument. Now you have two different modes. You have the step mode, which is just kind of placing the pattern in, or playing the pattern in, which would be tap mode. And I'm going to do both. So I'm going to first select my instrument, which is going to be my kick drum. I'm going to hit play, and then I'm just going to play that in. So now we've got a kick drum, and we can do that same thing. We can select the clap and put that on the toot. And then let's play in the open hat. So here's our hat. Right? It quantizes it for those with shit timing, especially when on camera. Now the other thing, to get it kind of closer to what we had used in Up and Down, it was kind of a pattern like this. It was a very tight, hi-hat sound, right? And to get it even closer, I'm gonna select the closed hat, and I'm going to grab that. And that's pretty much where I was at. And then we kind of programmed a couple different other iterations of it. Now we could keep going. We could build on top of this and, maybe put in the ride. so you can really quickly, like you saw, I can really quickly get some ideas going. And that's why I love this so much, is because it's great for jamming. You could, I've played with these synths in conjunction with that. It's great for getting ideas going. It's good for later in the production process. Maybe you just want to sample that. Maybe we need something creative to help finish a record, and that's what it's great to go from there as well. So that's the TR-09, and I think that was really a genesis of Up and Down, and why this record is connected so much with Deep Root Records, and hopefully it's connecting with you. This is kind of the end of the video, so if I could ask for your support, if I could ask for you to buy the record on Traxsource, stream it on Spotify, it really means so much to me and Dutcheast, Andre, my good buddy, and it's really kind of an interesting way to end the year. We wrote this record the day that Kobe died, and it's releasing kind of at the end of probably the most historic year in at least my entire lifetime. So we're hoping that this record connects with you and hopefully brings about some better days in 2021. So thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Clavette out. Peace.